To win the iPhone, treats and £15,000 cash, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can also enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2 or post your name and number to GB06 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threats on.
As time passes,
she could have saved Storm.
You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel. This is GB News and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians in the media, but actually it's about you.
And we won't forget that.
Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
More than ever, it's important to hear
all sides
as you make your decision ahead of polling day.
We're here for you.
This is GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's election channel.
And this is a GB News election special with me, Camilla Tominey. Welcome to Vote 2024, The Leaders. Welcome to this special edition of Vote 2024. Tonight we're going to bring you a one-to-one interview between the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey, and GB News' political editor, Christopher Hope. We're fast approaching the 1-week mark till the general election. Last week we interviewed Sir Keir Starmer as part of our Vote 2024, the Leaders series, and today we bring you Sir Ed Davey.
I'm not proud of every vote I made in that and the decisions of that government.
Some regrets there, but also some confessions.
You bet on election results in the past when you were an MP?
Well, very few. I've never bet on myself.
Well, as new polling suggests, the Lib Dems will become the official opposition. Is this what we can really expect?
I think we need a trade deal. We need a trade deal really quickly.
Well, with me to discuss this, we will have voices from each of the 3 major political parties, with reaction from the Home Secretary, James Cleverly, later on. We've got a cracking show lined up tonight, but first, here's the news.
At just after 7 o'clock, the latest news headlines from the GB newsroom, and a new poll out within the last hour has predicted the Conservatives are set to lose most of their parliamentary seats and will likely have fewer seats than the Liberal Democrats, who will become the official opposition. The new poll from Electoral Calculus forecasts that Labour will win 450 seats, the Lib Dems 71 seats and the Conservatives 60 seats. It's likely as well the Reform Party will win around 18 seats, including those of Nigel Farage, Richard Tice and Lee Anderson. The forecast Labour victory would be larger than Tony Blair's landslide in 1997 and be the largest win by any party in modern parliamentary history, except for back in 1931. The 60 seats the Conservatives are likely to get, according to this poll, could be their worst result since at least 1900. Well, today, the Scotland Secretary, Alistair Jack, insisted he hadn't broken any rules after he admitted to placing 3 bets on the date of the election. The Cabinet Minister said he had no inside knowledge of when the election would take place, despite previously bragging he'd made more than £2,000 on the bet. Later, he dismissed that as a joke. Mr Jack becomes the 7th person to become embroiled in the scandal, with just a week until voters head to the polls. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, says the Tories have taken too long to deal with the scandal.
I made very clear that if any of my candidates was being investigated in relation to the Gambling Commission, I'd remove them straight away, which is what I've done. That's in a sharp contrast to Rishi Sunak, who took days and days and days before he took action. There's a wider story here about the choice at the general election next week between carrying on with what we've had for the last 14 years or so. The inaction by Rishi Sunak is just absolutely in keeping with the way that they've governed for 14 years, or turning the page and starting to rebuild the country.
Early morning calls to GP practices in an effort to lock in limited appointments could become a thing of the past under plans to bolster the NHS app. Labour says its plan would see the app updated to encompass several health professionals, including GPs, physiotherapists and dentists, to make securing an appointment simple and easy. It's not been clear how old people will access this app. The party says 5 million people tried to and failed to get a GP appointment every month last year. The Liberal Democrats have announced a plan to give every cancer patient a dedicated specialist nurse to support them through their treatment. It would see nearly 3,500 new nurses recruited across England, doubling the existing workforce by the end of the next Parliament. The party's leader, Ed Davey, says it's a critical step towards fixing the NHS. That's the news. For the latest stories, head to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you very much, Polly. Well, welcome to the second interview in our Vote 2024 The Leaders interview series. Earlier today, our GB News political editor, Christopher Hope, spoke to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Sir Ed Davey, thank you for joining us today on GB News. Is it time to ban politicians from betting on politics?
I really think we need to review the whole of gambling regulation with respect to politics. And I really hope after the election, that's what the new government and Parliament gets behind. There's got to be much greater transparency and clarification about what is possible and what's not possible. I think people are confused, except in this particular case. I don't think there's any black and white in this particular case. People literally went
case, the Conservative case.
The Conservative. People appear to. I mean, let's see the Gambling Commission's inquiry. But from what we hear from the media and elsewhere, people went into a room in number 10, were told the date of the general election, then went out of that room and placed a bet on it.
So we don't know any of that.
I made it clear that that's what we appear. And do you know what? I think people know that if you place a bet and you know the outcome of that, that is just clearly wrong.
But you've bet before on politics.
Well, yeah, I've placed the odd bet. I haven't bet on this election.
No.
Frankly, I've been to...
But you bet on election results in the past when you were an MP?
Well, very few. I've never bet on myself. But what I'd like is this review in gambling regulations on politics, so we can clarify that sort of thing. You know, there's this case of this Labour candidate who bet on himself losing. I think he was wrong. I've never bet on myself, but there may be candidates in the past, maybe candidates in this election who've done similar to him. And what Liberal Democrats want to do is make sure that all the rules around that are completely clarified.
Yeah.
We'll only do that if we have a full review of the regulation on gambling in politics. Although, just to be clear, what happened in 10 Downing Street, as far as it appears, goes beyond that review. That was clearly wrong. If you bet on something and you know the outcome, that is wrong.
OK. Looking at your whole campaign, you've had great fun. We last saw you at Thorpe Park. What do you think sub-postmasters make of you clowning around?
Well, listen, my heart's gone out to sub-postmasters about what's happened with the worst miscarriage of justice in British history over Horizon. And I've said sorry for the mistakes I made when I was a minister, when I didn't see Alan Bates straight away. And then when I did see him as the first minister to see him, putting his case to the Post Office and not seeing through the lies that they told to me, other ministers, sub-postmasters, and to the courts. So I hope they understand that. I'm campaigning now both for constituents of mine who are sub-postmasters who were involved in this. I had a really, really tough time. I'm campaigning for compensation for all sub-postmasters who are affected, far more generous, far more quickly, and I supported this inquiry, which is so important to get to the bottom of it. So I hope they've heard that. What I would say on terms of the stunts, if you like, is that's in my role as leader of the party to make sure people both notice what we're doing and also every time linking something quite serious. So I think in politics, particularly when people are so disillusioned, that they don't want politicians to take themselves too seriously, but they do want politicians to address their serious problems. And when I came down that slide in Somerset, it was fun, I agree, but we're releasing our policy on mental health for children and young people.
There's no link there between the two. It's just Millie, you're getting a nice pitch.
Well, I think it was actually, because, outdoor activity, fun with families, that's great for mental health. But what we were saying was, the social media companies, the social media giants, they should pay more in what we call digital services tax. That should fund a full-time mental health professional in every primary and secondary school. So we linked that to that stunt, just in the way we linked the stunt when I fell off that paddleboard, once intentionally, 4 times by mistake, into Lake Windermere. That was about sewage, the sewage scandal.
Understood.
So we're trying to link the two.
Okay. Here's your manifesto. We're there to cover the launch of it. What's the ideological thread running through this? It strikes me that you are different things in different parts of the country. You're kind of attacking the Tories, attacking Labour, wherever you are. I mean, if you define liberalism in a tweet, how would you for us?
Well, we want a fair deal. That's what it's called on the manifesto. A fair deal, whether it's on the health service, whether it's in the economy, whether it's on things like the environment. But liberalism, if you were wanting to ask me for the grand analysis, I think we want to empower people to be the best they can. So we want them to have good health services, so that's not getting in the way of working and being the best they can. We want to make sure children have the best start in life. That's empowering people, making sure they have the chance, that the businesses have the chance to thrive. That's empowering people. But we also, and this may be different from some of the parties, we want to hold the already powerful to account. People, I think, are fed up of some big business, not all, but some, like the water companies, getting away with pumping their filthy sewage, or some of the
post office.
Well, the post office, indeed. The post office executives need to be held to account too. I'm very much in favour of that. And what I'd also say is, the scandals of the post office, you could link them to the scandals with respect to contaminated blood, to Hillsborough, where people lied, and we've got to hold those people to account better. We need to change the system. And that's one thing that Liberal Democrats are very different from others. We want to change the system, not just the electoral system, but we want to make sure that people who lie get found out.
And it's about local champions, you're saying here, don't you? Because you don't want to be Prime Minister. Well, you want to be, but you can't be. Or will you be?
Well, listen, when I took over the Liberal Democrats, we'd had 3 poor elections. That's beyond that.
Last leader thought she was Prime Minister.
And so I'm focusing on where I think we can win, and we can win in many seats.
Okay.
And to be honest, I'm really quite excited about this election. I'm very grateful to those people who were thinking of voting Labour and Green, but realise that they're in an area like here in Chelmsford where they can't win, and only the Liberal Democrats can beat the Conservatives. And Chris, this is so different from other elections. We're hearing from people who've always voted Conservative. Their whole families have always voted Conservative.
Tory seat, 17,000 majority here in Chelmsford.
And they're saying they're not going to do it this time. Now, some of them might not vote, might go back to Tories eventually, might vote Reform. A lot of them are voting Liberal Democrat, and I'm very grateful for them. And I want to, in the days that remain, I want to explain our health policies are relevant to them and their families. Our care policies are relevant to them and their families, whether it's on personal care, whether it's on cancer. I just hope those people who have always voted Tory, Conservative, give us a chance.
Just some quick questions about the policies here. Page 122 in your policy document, you want to rejoin the EU single market. When and what's after that? The customs union too?
Probably not in this coming Parliament, to be honest. The relationship between the UK and Europe has been so bad.
By 2035?
It's impossible to put a date on it. Here's why. We've got to rebuild that relationship. The Conservatives have been in conflict with our European partners, which is quite sad. They've been our allies, they're our friends, they're our nearest neighbours. And when we're in an insecure world, when Putin is invading Ukraine, when you've got things like illegal criminal gangs operating globally with cybercrime and human trafficking, you have to work internationally. So we want to rebuild that relationship to keep people in our country safer and more prosperous, and that will take some time.
In your lifetime, do you want to see Britain back in the EU?
Listen, because you've got a lot of work to do to even be able to contemplate something like that, I wouldn't
You wouldn't even go that far.
Listen, I'll tell you one thing we can do. Let me be frank with you. I think we need a trade deal, and we need a trade deal really quickly. Our economy is being hurt by the awful trade deal the Conservatives concluded with our European partners. Our farmers are being hit, our fishermen are being hit, our exporters and importers are being hit. Actually, people are being hit by high prices in the shops. So we've got to have a trade deal. It can't be the single market. I've talked to European politicians. That's not on the table. What we can do, though, is a much better trade deal, mutually beneficial. And I think that would really help revive our economy, get the growth we need, and help bear down on inflation too.
Well, to get the reaction to that interview, I'm joined by a superstar panel. We've got the Reds, we've got the Blues, we've got the Yellows, all in the studio with me. So former Environment Secretary George Eustace, former Liberal Democrat Minister Norman Baker, and former Labour MEP and MP Sean Simon. Lovely to see you this evening, gents. First of all, come on, be honest. Who's placed bets on political matters in the past?
I never have, actually. I tried to bet on myself in '97, but I couldn't get anyone to take the bet, which is a great shame, because I ended 123 years of Tory rule in Lewis.
In favour of yourself, Norman, or betting against yourself?
No, in favour of myself.
It's slightly odd, isn't it, to be betting against yourself in a constituency, Sean?
Well, no, I mean, I think it's quite understandable. It's kind of, you know, it's emotional insurance, isn't it? It's like, if you lose the election, at least you win the bet.
Fair enough.
You can see why somebody would do it, although I'm not saying it was a good idea.
No. George, ever had a flutter?
No, I've got to be honest, whenever elections have been called, I've always been so busy thinking, you know, how on earth do we win this or make sure we hold on to power that I haven't really thought. It hasn't crossed my mind.
I mean, this is the problem, isn't it, for the Tories, that they should have been focused on the election and not doing other things, but fair enough. Let's talk then about this polling and whether you find it credible. So, as I just explained earlier, we've got electoral calculus. To be fair, this poll was conducted before this interview and therefore Ed Davey won't be aware of the results, but he will be now. Electoral calculus, which is carried out this MRP poll with thousands of people asked, has got the following seat predictions. So the Conservatives down to 60, the Labour Party on 450 seats, the Libs on 71. So that would then place Sir Ed Davey as the opposition leader, Reform on 18, and then Greens 4, SNP 24, Plaid Cymru 4, and others 1. So the big takeaways there are this notion that we're going to wake up on July the 5th and Sir Ed Davey will be opposition leader. Sean, do you think that's credible?
No, it's not. I mean, these MRP polls, it's a new kind of polling, and they come out with quite wildly different results. They all show Labour winning comfortably, but there's a lot of variation at the extremes. This is quite far down the extreme end. I think the Conservatives will be the second party, the Lib Dems will be third, and the Reform probably won't get any seats at all.
Well, we don't know, because this is an uncharted water we're in now, and the Tories are in free fall, and who knows where the votes are going to go. I mean, certainly around in the south of England, it's ABC, anyone but Conservatives, and people are working out how to vote. What I would say is that the first past the post system disbenefits us normally as Lib Dems, but it does benefit us in this sort of election where you can concentrate your votes. And actually, my belief genuinely is that the Conservative vote in the south, which is full of people who are business people, who are affected by Brexit, who want public services to work properly, and so on. Actually, they're more likely to vote against the Conservatives this time than perhaps the Conservatives in the north are.
We'll get on to first past the post and proportional representation in a minute, because I think he also talks about whether he'd work with Farage on that. We'll get to that in a moment. George, counteract that from Norman. I mean, 60 seats, that would be absolutely catastrophic.
If this poll is right, then there's no silver lining in it, obviously, for the Conservatives. But I think Sean's right. We're seeing a number of these polls, and they're showing quite varied results. MRP polls are typically showing anything from 50 seats for us up to about 150 seats. So there's quite a range there. And the truth is we don't know. And there have been elections in the past, I think 1992 was one, where the pollsters have turned out to get it wrong. And that's because every time they do a lot of funny weighting. They have to weight a poll to make it representative. Sometimes they get that wrong. And because they go like a flock of sheep, they tend to try and make sure that they're not outliers and that their polls are roughly consistent. So we don't know. We may wake up on polling day and it could still be a bad defeat for us, but we might be south of 200 but over 150, or
over 150
maybe.
will feel like a good result, won't it?
Well, it will now, given these polls. I think there's another thing, actually, I'm a little bit concerned about. I mean, we've always had polls in elections, but it's not long ago that the Times got into trouble for having an MRP-style poll published during an election, because, of course, on election day itself, there's a very strict rule around the publication of exit polls, because there's a worry that you might influence somebody going to the polls at 8 o'clock in the evening. And here we are with these polls predicting seat by seat with 19,000 samples over quite a long period.
These techniques have come on. Sean, do you think it's fair for Ed Davey to be copying all of this criticism for not meeting with Sir Alan Bates, the postmaster, those years ago? I mean, apparently, according to quite a few candidates I've spoken to, it does keep on coming up on the doorstep.
I don't know if it's fair. I think it's inevitable. You know, it's as he said in his interview, it's the biggest miscarriage of justice ever, and you know he's in the frame. I understand, given speaking not just as our former colleague, distinguished colleagues, but as a former minister myself, as the other two are as well. I can understand if you're presented with something that you're told is a terrible miscarriage of justice, you put it to a great British institution, they tell you absolutely categorically point blank, that's absolutely not the case, we absolutely guarantee that it's wrong. I understand a minister who says, well...
I know, but maybe the criticism is that quite a few people showed a lack of curiosity, not least when journalists have been writing about this for decades. Norman, let's just bring you in briefly before we go to the break, and then we'll catch the second half of this interview. Just on this whole idea of rejoining the EU, can you put a timeline on that? Do you think the Liberal Democrats will continue to push for that, not just in this Parliament, but possibly 2029?
What I do know is that the population at large, now if the polls are to be believed, in different polls on this occasion, actually think Brexit's a mistake, and the majority want to come back into the EU at some point. But
even if they have to accept free movement?
Well, that's a tough one. And as Ed says, nothing's going to happen in the short term or even the medium term, because there's a lot of rebuilding to do. But what I do know is we've lost 4% of GDP as a consequence of Brexit, and that's damaging our businesses.
All right, hold that thought. Thank you very much to everyone on my panel. We're going to be coming back to you again shortly. Up next, it's going to be the second part of our one-to-one interview with Sir Ed Davey. Does he regret voting for the bedroom tax? Would he work in opposition with Nigel Farage? That's all still to come. Don't go anywhere.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
We're very lucky to have an heir to the throne who is dutiful, loves his family, and he still takes all the children to school in the morning. And you can't really hope for anything more than that, can you? And he's behaved with such dignity. He must be so worried about his father and his lovely wife.
I wonder what the royals are going to do if the next generation of people aren't armed forces, if they don't join the army or the navy or the air force or whatever.
This is very interesting because Prince William doesn't necessarily want little George to do that. He doesn't feel it's necessary. But it's such a stamp on the royal family, isn't it? And with all the costumes, and they're the head of the army. And so what would they do without that? I find that very difficult. I think it's the same with religion, actually, because he's not religious, William. He does go once or twice a year, but he hasn't got the same passion about religion that King Charles does. And I think it's very difficult. I think it'll be maybe a very changed royal family.
Indeed, yeah. We don't know yet who's going to be attending Royal Ascot, but we suspect at the very least the Queen, probably the King and Queen, and maybe even the Prince of Wales as well.
You can't keep the Queen away from horses. I mean, she absolutely loves them. She used to ride them non-stop when she was little. And fascinatingly, her mother never bothered about it because they weren't mobiles then. And she would go off riding for hours and sleep
what a
in a field.
Life. What an incredible
and then
childhood.
come back the next day. She never worried about her. She thought she was sensible. She loves animals, dogs and horses. That's one of the things she had very much in common with the late Queen.
The People's Channel.
Join me, Nana Okoye, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled.
Lovely. Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News.
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Vote 2024, The Leaders, with me, Camilla Tominey. Just before the break, we heard the first part of the interview with the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey. He talked about the fact that he had placed a few bets in the past, but not on the outcome of an election. He talked about how he appreciated and apologised for failing to meet with Sir Alan Bates, the sub-postmaster who has led that campaign on behalf of those who were served that miscarriage of justice. And he talked about the Liberal Democrats' desire to seek closer alignment with the EU. Well, let's take a listen now at part two.
Just elsewhere, you want to look at reinstate maintenance grants for disadvantaged children, look at student finance. Would you vote to increase tuition fees in the next Parliament?
That's not in our manifesto. What we're saying in our manifesto about student finance is the maintenance grants that the Conservatives took away from the system that when we were influencing it, they've got to be restored. But we insisted on high maintenance grants, but the Tories took them away. And that's meant that people from poorer backgrounds have been less able to go to university. So what we're saying in our manifesto as our priority for student finance is restoring those grants.
Would you vote to increase tuition fees?
It's not in our manifesto.
Will you vote to increase tuition fees? Want to say yes or no?
Yeah, no. Well,
it might well happen in the next Parliament. You well know.
No, really, really clear. We are campaigning, not just for this election, but after election, according to that manifesto. You go into the election seeking a mandate.
And you may not silent on tuition fees, the big thing that affects so many students.
We won't need to if we have maintenance grants, we run our economy properly. The universities need more money. Let's be really clear on that. And we want to grow our economy so they can get more money. But I don't think all the money has to come from Breeze.
Bedroom tax, page 52. You say you'll scrap it, but you voted to bring it in 2011, in June 2011, and you missed 2 votes as an MP and member of the coalition government in February 2012 and February 2014. So you voted to bring in the bedroom tax, but you want to scrap it in this document. Why?
Well, Chris, I've fought the Conservatives all my life. Well, no, let me. I want to ask you a question. I promise.
Okay.
And I fought them in coalition. Sometimes I won. Sometimes the Liberal Democrats won. We made them do things they didn't want to do, like give free school meals to infants. George Osborne didn't want to do that. We stopped them when they wanted to really cut welfare benefits even more. But we weren't able to win everything, and the bedroom tax got through. I'm not proud of every vote I made in that and the decisions of that government. But we want to reverse that. We're standing in.
So you regret
election.
that support?
What I want to do is get that election manifesto implemented. If we can implement Liberal Democrat ideas, we can make a much fairer country, and we want a fair deal, as it says on the cover.
A fair deal. On net zero, page 24, you want to bring in. You want to introduce a new Chief Secretary for Sustainability in the Treasury. Is that a minister or an official?
It's a minister. We want
in the cabinet.
Yeah, we want them to be held to account for how we go about getting net zero.
Different to a climate change minister or secretary, or
well, I wonder. Well, I've observed over years in politics that unless you get the Treasury on side, you don't take action. So that's what thinking.
Champion in the Treasury.
Yeah, it has to be a champion. But let me say this to your viewers. I was proud that the Liberal Democrats quadrupled Britain's renewable power and got the price of renewable power down, made Britain the world leader in offshore wind. Renewable power, which Liberal Democrats have been the champions, the most successful party in British politics on, is now the most popular and the cheapest form. So if you want to have cheaper energy bills in the future, vote Liberal Democrat.
OK. On cannabis, a legally regulated market for cannabis, this document says, will this lead to cannabis-addled zombies roaming the streets, to use a tabloid headline? I mean, also, you did vote, didn't you, for the gradual removal of the right to smoke for over 16. So how does that tally with?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked. Let me take you through that. First, on our policy on cannabis, we want to get rid of the very potent, health-damaging cannabis. The skunk is often called. We want to get that out.
Herbal's okay, but skunk.
Yeah, so a regulator market, like they've done in many states in the United States, Canada, and European countries, that's found to help young people, actually. It means that the resources can be put on the criminal gangs, these really nasty people selling their misery. We want to crack down on them. And that's a sensible, evidence-led way of doing it. You mentioned the smoking. I'm very happy to come to that. I'm not in here, is it? No, because it was a free vote. Yeah. And some of my colleagues voted different ways. I tell you what, I voted for what Rishi Sunak was putting forward, and I haven't often said that in my life. I voted it because I looked at what my life has been like. I lost both my parents to cancer. It wasn't smoking related, as it happens, but I know the impact cancer can have on people, and it's tough. And when you're seeing children lose their parents from cancer that's related to tobacco, you sort of feel you have to do something. And as a Liberal, I struggled with this, but I came to that conclusion. And is it consistent with what we're saying on cannabis? It is, actually, because in cannabis, as I've said, we're taking out the really harmful stuff, the skunk, which is damaging to children and young people's health. We want to really make sure that is outlawed. But the stuff that isn't so potent is okay. And that's the same thing with respect to smoking. The cigarettes that are so damaging, that they will have to go, of course, in my own personal view. But I think nicotine that's in vaping, for example, we're not going to ban that.
Understood. Just taking a step back, and thank you for your time today. You might end up working with minor parties, the one led by Nigel Farage. Will you be happy doing that in the next Parliament?
I share no values at all. The Liberal Democrats share no values at all with Nigel Farage and reform. He's every right to...
Even on defence? On defence, you're quite aligned.
I think he was being an apologist to Putin, which is probably the most important defence and security issue facing our country. Liberal Democrats have, I think, been one of the strongest parties saying we need to stand by Ukraine. And when I go around our country, cities and towns and villages, I see British people with the British flag and the Ukrainian flag. I think a true patriot is behind Ukraine and is against Putin. And I can't understand why those politicians like him are in favour of Putin.
Just very finally, quick questions here. Gary Lineker or Gareth Southgate? Who do you support?
Well, Gary Southgate, he's in charge.
And last night you were in the palace, you were in the Japanese state banquet. If you could take home one souvenir from the banquet, what would it have been?
You know what? The flower arranging was amazing. My wife and me commented on that. Can I let you into a little secret?
Oh, no, this thing, just you and you and me.
Well, our wonderful late Queen, she used to spend, there's probably a budget for this, she used to spend it on an extra dessert of pineapple. And I think the King decided that he'd rather spend that money on flowers. And I hope I'm not giving away a secret I'm not supposed to. Okay. But the flowers were absolutely beautiful.
Better than normal.
Well, I think a bit more money has been spent on it, rather than pineapples.
Sir Davey, in a park here in Essex, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Our interview with all the leaders on GB News. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there we have it. Like the flower arrangements at Buckingham Palace last night. Let me bring in my superstar panel again. George Eustace, former Environment Secretary, former Liberal Democrat Minister Norman Baker, former Labour MEP and MP Sean Simon. Now, let's think. Legalising cannabis. A good idea? Norman, you were once the minister in charge of drugs.
I was, and the policy, which is in the Lib Dem manifesto, is the one I was trying to push through in government, as a matter of fact. I conducted a study of international comparators demonstrating that the policy which we've had since 1971 in this country wasn't working. It was necessary to treat drugs as a health issue, not as a criminal issue, and those countries which do so have lower drug use. And it's absolutely right that what Ed says, that if you actually have a state control system, you can then sell cannabis which is controlled, which is less harmful, and you can get skunk off the market. And that makes a lot of sense.
Although, hasn't decriminalising cannabis been linked to quite a lot of lawlessness in some American states? George, what do you think?
Well, I think this has been looked at several times by government, and the concern always is, I mean, there's a legitimate point, which is that the higher strength skunk is what should be targeted as a point of law enforcement. But the worry always is that it's the signal that it sends. If you decriminalise one part of the market, it sends a wider signal on drugs, and the concern is always that you'll actually see an uptick in use. So I think, it's not an illegitimate point to raise, and he's absolutely right, I think, about targeting the higher strength skunk as a point of enforcement. But I think when it's been looked at before, governments have always stepped back from it just because of the wider signal it sends.
Sean?
I think it's a discussion that we should keep having, and I think we should have a grown-up and sensible discussion about it. Personally, I don't feel like we've quite reached that point yet, and I don't feel like the country is at that point yet. But I don't think it should be, as it used to be, something that we're not allowed to talk about.
I called for the legalisation of medicinal cannabis when I was in government, much to Theresa May's horror as Home Secretary, I might say. And to my astonishment, the Daily Mail, the Sun and the press all by and large agree with me on that point.
Yeah, OK. Let's talk about the Liberal Democrats not sharing any values at all with Nigel Farage. Is that the right thing to say? I mean, there are quite a few old Labour voters in the Red Wall that supported Boris Johnson and, by association, must have quite supported Nigel Farage, at least on the issue of Brexit.
I wasn't sure if that was pure political calculation, because that's where Ed Davey feels like his votes come from. Because that's where he feels like his votes come from.
But if he wants to appeal to Tories, he's going to have to appeal to Leavers as well as Remainers, isn't he?
I wasn't sure if it was actually his personal distaste. He looked very contemptuous when he said it.
Yes.
But, there are a very large number of people in this country who do share a lot of values with Nigel Farage. So what is Ed Davey saying to them?
George?
Well, I mean, of course, he would work with him on some things like proportional representation if it,
would he?
ever came
We'll get
up.
onto that maybe later, but
well,
yes,
I'm sure he would, because they've both got the same positions, and opposition parties, will work together and vote in the same lobbies when they've got a shared interest. But, overall, obviously, the Liberal Democrats come from a very different perspective to Nigel Farage, and I suppose he doesn't think many of his voters would consider voting Nigel Farage, so he's just doubled down and made that point.
Yeah, Norman, not working with Nigel Farage, that's not very Liberal or Democratic, is it?
Well, I mean, if Nigel was Liberal and Democratic, it would be rather peculiar, wouldn't it? Rather different. But look, I mean, I think he's right. That was a personal opinion he expressed there. It was personal distaste. It wasn't a calculation as to why the voters are going to respond. And actually, I think that's rather welcome. He gave a straight answer to a straight question.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you very much indeed to my panel this evening. Up next, we're going to go live to our political editor, Christopher Hope, who will be speaking to the Home Secretary, James Cleverly. Don't go anywhere.
Hello and welcome to the latest update from the Met Office for GB News. Following another hot day for many, it's warm overnight, but cooler air is on the way and windier weather. This unseasonably deep low pressure arriving for Thursday and Friday, that's going to bring some unseasonable strong winds to Western Scotland and Northern Ireland. Now, it's not been hot everywhere during Wednesday, but for much of central and southeastern England, it has been another very warm or hot one, and it's going to stay warm in these areas overnight despite the clear spells, 17 Celsius. Further west and north, we've got showery rain moving in, cloud and an increased breeze. So by dawn, much more unsettled across parts of Western Scotland, Northern Ireland, the winds picking up strength through the morning, bands of rain moving into the west coast. We've also got some heavy showers pushing through the Northern Isles, perhaps the odd rumble of thunder. Brighter skies for much of the rest of Scotland, feeling cooler here. And for much of northern and western England, Wales, cloudier conditions to begin things, although the rain on the weather front that is making the change tending to peter out, and really it's just a band of cloud and a few spots of rain as it pushes into the Midlands, and then by the afternoon East Anglia in the southeast. As that rain arrives and as the cloud thickens, the wind changes direction, temperatures aren't going to reach the highs that we saw in the last couple of days. We're looking at closer to 25, 26 Celsius in the east and southeast. But sunshine returns by the end of the day across much of England and Wales. Blustery showers in the west and the north. And, as I say, unseasonably windy through Thursday, especially in the far north and northwest, and into Friday we've still got some heavy showers moving through and some strong winds that could impact any outdoor events that are taking place. And so watch out for that. Into the weekend, mixed conditions, some cloud, a bit of rain here and there, but also some sunshine, temperatures back to average.
Congratulations to the GB News winners at this year's Trick Awards.
And the winner of Interview of the Year is... Alistair Stewart reveals his heartbreaking diagnosis to Camilla Tominey.
And the winner is GB News Breakfast. And the winner is Nigel Farage.
And thank you to you, our GB News viewers and listeners, for making us the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates. You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it? Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained. I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Vote 2024, The Leaders, with me, Camilla Tominey. Before the break, we heard the second part of GB News' interview with the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey. He was speaking to Christopher Hope, who I hope can join us now. He's in Nottingham because he's in the spin room for the latest and last TV debate between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Chris, it's interesting now we've got this MRP polling from Electoral Calculus, because you didn't know then what you know now, and I'm wondering, is Sir Ed Davey a political leader who is ready, willing and able to serve as leader of the opposition potentially, Chris?
Yeah, that's quite something, isn't it, Camilla? That's right. Well, that MRP polling from Electoral Calculus and Find Out Now, which we couldn't really discuss with Sir Ed Davey before it came out at 5 o'clock, does show the Lib Dems on 71 seats. They are the leader. He'll be the leader of the opposition. He wouldn't believe his luck, and with that becomes a pay rise for him. He may not have got if he'd been third place in the election next week. Bigger status. It becomes the Her Majesty's opposition. It might be the breakthrough moment the Lib Dems have been waiting for, with the Tories down on 60 MPs, and of course Reform UK on 18. That's so surprising. I was struck by that interview. When he talked about the issue of sub-postmasters. Many people are saying, what would the sub-postmasters make of his clowning around on the election campaign? And he got quite tough there. He linked it, as he saw it, to the contaminated blood scandal, Hillsborough, where people have lost their lives. He saw that he equated the behaviour of the post office with the wrongdoing in those two scandals. I thought it was he tried to link his various stunts to a serious campaign message, sewer issues in Windermere, and mental health on the fun fair and the like. I asked him 3 times whether he might vote to increase tuition fees. That, I think, will be a big issue of the next Parliament, because that £9,000 a year figure is unlikely to hold, I think, and may have to well go up. And we challenged him about the bedroom tax, which of course he voted for in 2011 and now wants to axe. And he's making very clear his views on Nigel Farage. He wouldn't want to work with him, even if they're both in opposition. So quite a varied interview there with Ed Davey, I think, but someone who seems very relaxed, very ready for next week. He was talking to us in a seat where there's a Tory majority of around 15,000. They clearly think they're going to take seats off the Tories in the south-west and south of England, the so-called Blue Wall, and we'll wait and see if that happens.
Good stuff, Christopher. Now, do you have James Cleverly with you, or are we waiting for the Home Secretary to appear, Chris?
We are just waiting for him to appear. I'll look over my shoulder.
I know, you look cleverly-less.
He's doing LBC.
He may be doing an interview
so
with someone else. All right, let's go to our panel. And if you do get the Home Secretary, Chris, we'll go back to you in Nottingham. Well, I'm still joined by Sean Simon, former Labour MEP and MP, Norman Baker, former Liberal Democrat Minister, and George Eustace, former Environment Secretary. Let's just remind ourselves of some of those key points in the interview. So let's look at what Sir Ed Davey said about the EU, first of all.
I think we need a trade deal. We need a trade deal really quickly. Our economy is being hurt by the awful trade deal the Conservatives concluded with our European partners. Our farmers are being hit, our fishermen are being hit, our exporters and importers are being hit. Actually, people are being hit by high prices in the shops. So we've got to have a trade deal.
Now, George, I know you wanted to come in on that because you're the only Brexiteer on this panel, although I have confessed in columns to supporting the Leave side. George, what do you think? I mean, the idea of the Liberal Democrats sort of trying to undo the referendum result doesn't strike me, as I've said earlier in this show, as either Liberal or Democratic, but what's your view?
No, and they're being very careful, obviously, not to say that they would rejoin the single market. I mean, apart from anything else, obviously, they won't be in government able to do that, and that's a recognition of the reality. But look, I think a Labour government would face exactly the same problem that the current Conservative governments face. This caricature that we sort of threw the table over and stomped out of the EU and wanted to cut ourselves off is actually completely false. Yeah, we took a democratic decision as a country to leave the European Union and become a self-governing country again. But at that point, we did say to the European Union, let's be friends, let's work together, let's have digital processes at the border, let's recognise equivalence in regulation where we can so that we can work together in partnership. And I'm afraid what happens every single time when you try to have these conversations with the EU, first of all, they demand money. Yeah. And so when we tried to have a sensible conversation, for instance, about a youth mobility scheme so that young people could travel, the EU came back and said, give us money, we want cash. And when you try and have any kind of discussion about breaking down some of those regulatory barriers and paperwork for exports and imports, the first thing the EU say is, we will not accept you setting your own laws and regulations. So we require the right to dictate what British law should be as the price for removing some of these things. And no self-respecting UK government, having now opted for independence, can accept the kind of demands that the EU always put on the table. So I think that the Labour government, if there is one, will also find it very, very difficult to make progress on this because, the EU, basically, they want money, they want fish, and they want to be able to dictate what our laws are.
Very, very quickly in response to that, chaps. Really quickly. Sean, you're laughing.
It's not true. The truth is that the Tories, not just at the point of final negotiations, but for years throughout the Brexit process, were incredibly contemptuous and aggressive and scornful of our European partners. And do you think they don't hear that? Do you think it makes no difference?
Quickly,
that's perfectly true, that last point. The other thing is we can't leave things as they are. Brexit has been very damaging to our economy. It's a duty of any government coming in to try and remedy that as best they can.
But Michel Barnier said this week, we can't cherry-pick. If you want to rejoin the EU or any of its institutions, you've got to accept free movement. That's not going to be popular on the doorstep.
It's not going to be popular on the doorstep. So we have to go into a negotiation about it.
All right. Let's have a look now, because we're going to have a discussion about proportional representation, at what Sir Ed Davey said about the prospect of working with Nigel Farage on that campaign.
I share no values at all. The Liberal Democrats share no values at all with Nigel Farage and reform.
I mean, there's a bit of a contradiction here, isn't there? Because on one hand, you've had the Liberal Democrats campaigning for PR for many, many years, but yet when they were in coalition government with the Tories, they had to renege on a number of their key pledges. I'm not sure students have forgiven them, Sean, for abandoning their pledge to scrap tuition fees. He was asked repeatedly there by Chris Hope whether he would vote to scrap them, and he said no, because they weren't in the manifesto. So is this something that the Lib Dems really want, coalition? Isn't it better for Labour and the Lib Dems to get together and plan some backstage tactical voting?
The Lib Dems and Reform desperately want proportional representation because it's their only chance, as Norman knows, because it actually happened to him. His number came up. He was that lucky guy once in a century. It's their only chance to get into government. But actually, keeping Nigel out of government is one of the best things about first past the post. You see what's happened in a lot of the rest of Europe where proportional systems amplify the reach and the power of people whose politics is actually not in the mainstream, whereas the British system, it pulls us all back to the middle, and that's why we normally have sensible politics.
If we look at this MRP polling, Reform's vote share would actually be 18% in return for 18 seats. The Liberal Democrats would be much lower, 13%, in return for 71 seats. So you're going to get around 18% of the population not feeling that the parliamentary system properly represents them.
In real life, though, Reform is going to get 12% of the vote, and no seats. That's what's actually going to happen.
Well, we might hold you to that, Sean.
And 13% of the House of Commons is a lot more than 71. There should be a relationship between the number of votes cast and the representation in Parliament. We don't have that at the moment, and that's what's wrong with the system. And it's perfectly possible to create PR systems based on those that work. Look at Germany, for example, said PR since 1945. No problems over there. It's completely different, say, in Israel, where you've got minority parties running the show. You can design a PR system that works based on what we see around the world, and we should have that. Fair votes. The votes cast should represent the votes in the House of Commons. It doesn't at the moment.
Although, George, I mean, as we know from the history of broad church conservatism, parties themselves are coalitions, aren't they?
Absolutely. And so people can exaggerate the difference here. The big parties are coalitions. The Conservatives are a coalition of traditional Shire Tories, Libertarians, Free Traders. The Labour Party, you've got the cooperative movement, you've got the Blairites, you've got the Corbynites. It's always been that way. And what the major parties have to do is work very hard to keep that coalition together in order to be able to get in power and stay in power. So you can exaggerate the difference. The reason I prefer First Plus, the Post, is that I think it does give you the clarity generally of single-party government. And when you get single-party government, they've got lots of other political constraints on them, not least their own internal coalition.
But
at least you get the clarity.
George, if the Conservatives are reduced to 16% of the vote and are down to 60 seats, you might find the Tories backing PR.
Yeah, well, do you know, it would depend on who's left. It's not impossible. It's not impossible, but I think it's unlikely because the Conservative Party has got a long-standing position, and Labour Party too, especially when they get in power, of basically recognising the value of a single-party government.
These two want Buggins' turn. That's what it comes down to. You know, the best government in the last 20 years was a coalition government between the Tories and the Dems.
It wasn't.
It was stable. It lasted 5 years.
The best government since the war was the Blair government.
I'm talking about in the last 20 years. The best government in the last 20... Look at the chaos since the Lib Dems left government in 2015. Absolute chaos.
Well, do you think that's down to the Lib Dems using government, or do you think it's down to post-Brexit shocks? Do you think it might be down to a global pandemic? Do you think it might also be down to war in Ukraine? I mean, you can't seriously be saying, Norman, that Britain's gone to hell in a handcart because the Lib Dems aren't in charge.
There's an element of truth in that. We had to... Look, in coalition, we had to talk to our Conservative colleagues to get policies through and convince them, and they had to talk to us. That's a very mature way of government. What's happened since then is not...
You were rewarded. You were nearly destroyed in 2019.
Voters don't know what they're going to get because the parties basically have a manifesto and then ditch it all to get a coalition agreement.
That 2010 to 15 government began the process of eviscerating and breaking the economy, which we are reaping the poisonous fruits of now. It was a terrible, terrible,
Actually, we restored the government after 20 years.
Don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
We restored the government.
Terrible government.
Gentlemen, keep calm. We've got James Cleverly down the line with Christopher Hope in Nottingham. Christopher, I hope you are with the Home Secretary, if you can hear me. There he is.
I was in short pants, he was doing this.
All right, you ready?
I'm not quite sure.
Have you got James Cleverly with you, Chris?
Camilla, sorry, with me now is James Cleverly, the Home Secretary. James Cleverly, thank you for joining us on GB News tonight. What has your boss, Rishi Sunak, got to do to win?
I think he needs to do what we are doing on the doorstep here in the studio, which is to remind people this is a choice. And it's a choice between a Conservative Party that is committed to reducing taxation, committed to increasing our defence spending, committed to protecting our borders and bringing the Rwanda plan into full operation, and a Labour government that will put up taxes, will be soft on borders, will not fund our armed forces in the way they should be funded, and a vote for any other party will herald a Labour government.
OK, do you worry about this MRP polling tonight? Find out now, an electoral calculus, 19,000 people. Your party gets 60 MPs. The Labour landslide of 250 majority. The good news for you is you get your seat, but many of your colleagues don't.
So the message that those polls are sending, and the message I'm hearing on the door when I knock on doors in my constituency and elsewhere, don't match up. But look, I can't predict, and I'm not going to try and predict. What I'm going to do is what the Prime Minister is going to do tonight is fight for every vote, try and return as many Conservative MPs as possible. We would want to form a government, but if that isn't possible, we need to hold Labour to account, because we know that their plans, their unfettered spending, their unfettered taxation, their failure to deliver on public services, and we see that in Wales, we see that in London where they run things, we need to protect the the British people from that.
What's he got to do to change those numbers? You've been stuck on about 20 points behind Labour for the entire campaign. Tonight is a make-or-break night for Rishi Sunak. What's he got to do?
Well, I think there are millions of undecided voters. They may well have been frustrated with us, and I understand it. Of course, because of COVID, because of the war in Ukraine, there are things we wanted to achieve we've not been able to achieve. I get that frustration, but it's reminding those floating voters who haven't made their mind up yet that a Labour government would hurt them. And that's particularly true, I think, of potential reform voters. This is a Labour government led by someone who took the knee rather than supporting our police officers during the BLM riots, the person who said all immigration legislation was racist. The Labour Party is not what Britain needs, not what Britain wants, and the best way of making sure that they don't run away with it is by voting Conservative.
Your party lost all discipline. You've got colleagues of yours who've been betting on the date of the general election. Did you ever bet on the election date?
So I've never done political betting.
Not this time either?
No, never. And there are people from a number of different political parties, and indeed people that are not involved directly in party politics, that have done this. The PM is furious about this, as am I. Public service is about serving the public, and we should be relentlessly focused on that, particularly during general elections. So we have taken action. The behaviour has fallen below the level that we think is appropriate, which is why we have taken action. The Gambling Commission are doing their own investigation. We'll let them get on with that.
There are reports of 15 Tory candidates caught up in this. Is that a figure you recognise?
So I have no way.
But you wouldn't know.
Well, there's no reason why I would know. I have no way. But as I said, this should be about serving the public, and that's what we should all be focused on.
The polling tonight gives Reform UK 18 MPs next Friday. What's your message to people watching GB News, listening to GB News now, who are thinking of voting for Nigel Farage next week?
Well, you're not getting Nigel Farage, first point.
Well, you are getting him.
The point being is that so if that MRP poll is correct, the party, and I don't think it is, but the party that would actually be holding Labour to account is the Liberal Democrats. And the left of the Labour Party would be dragging Keir Starmer even further left, and he's pretty left-wing as it is. So it would be even higher taxes, even more woke, even more distractions away from bringing down taxes. It would be disastrous for the British people. That is why I'm determined to make sure that doesn't happen. And a vote for reform would make that more likely rather than less likely. That is the opposite of what my people in Braintree, the people in Clacton that I speak to, the people in Nottinghamshire that I've spoken to this afternoon. It's the opposite of what they want. Be careful what you vote for, because what you get, you will have to live with for at least 5 years. And a Labour Party would be disastrous for this country.
Do you despair how you got here? I mean, you didn't have to have the election now. You did have the election, and look where you are. You're facing annihilation at the polls.
Well, as I say, the conversations I'm having on the doors does not match what I'm seeing in the polls. We're going to fight for every vote, for every candidate, to get as many MPs. We want to form a government, but if the British people say that that is not what they want of us, then we will do everything we can to make sure the Labour Party doesn't ruin this country.
Thank you. Well, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, with firm message there for Tory voters who might go towards the Labour Party or Lib Dems. Don't do it, he's saying.
All right, don't do it. Thank you very much indeed, Chris Hope. And I'm sure you'll be feeding into the evening shows from that debate. Let's bring the panel back in. Sean, Norman and George. We know who's going to be leading the Labour Party after July the 4th. We know who's going to be leading the Liberal Democrats after July the 4th. We even know who's going to be leading Reform after July the 4th. But the Conservative Party, who do you think is best placed to take forward whatever's left? They're reduced to 60 seats, they're reduced to 150. Who can unite the right, Sean?
I've never placed a political bet in my life, but I wonder what odds you'd get on Nigel Farage leading the Tory party by the end of next year.
All right, OK, that's your wager. Norman?
Well, it would be Rishi, that's for certain. What will happen depends on which Tory MPs is returned. It could be a majority of One Nation Tory MPs, in which case they'll go for someone who thinks the Tories have to come back to the centre, or if there's a majority of what you might call far-right supporters, then they'll go over to the far right. Okay. So it really depends on the mixture of MPs.
Who's your money on, though, Norman? Give me a name.
I think they won't go for Farage, actually.
All right, George.
Well, yeah, you know, it's premature to say for obvious reasons because we haven't had the election yet. But if the poll is as bad as suggested, then you know it will very much depend on who's left. Obviously,
Who would
first
you
of
like?
all, I don't have a preference.
Come on,
I will say
George.
no. I actually
All right,
think.
how about this? Kenny or Penny? Quickly, because we're running out of time.
No, I'm not sure. I'm not going to get into that game. I actually think it's whoever can. You know, the party made itself relevant in 2019.
All right, we must go now. Thank you very much indeed, chaps, for joining me this evening. I'll be back here tomorrow at 7 p.m. Coming up next, we're going to have Michael Portillo hosting State of the Nation, so stay tuned for that.
It's the final week to see how you could win big this summer. First, there's a fabulous £15,000 in tax-free cash to ensure this summer is special. What would you spend that on? Next, you'll also receive the latest iPhone 15 and a set of Apple AirPods. And finally, £500 to spend at your favourite UK attraction. You have to hurry as lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday. For another chance to win the iPhone, treats and £15,000 cash, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can also enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2 or post your name and number to GB06 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Congratulations to the GB News winners at this year's Trick Awards.
And the winner of Interview of the Year is... Alistair Stewart reveals his heartbreaking diagnosis to Camilla Tominey.
And the winner is GB News Breakfast. And the winner is Nigel Farage.
And thank you to you, our GB News viewers and listeners, for making us the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates. You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it? Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained. I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
This is GB News and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians in the media, but actually it's about you.
And we won't forget that.
Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
More than ever, it's important to hear
all sides
as you make your decision ahead of polling day.
We're here for you.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's election channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together and what have we got, in my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. I'm Michael Portillo, bringing you State of the Nation. GB News' Vote 2024, the leaders with Ed Davey has arrived and we'll be discussing what the Liberal Democrat leader told the channel earlier. We'll also be hearing from the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Has a Gamblegate can of worms been opened? As a Cabinet Minister admits to betting on the election, reports suggest that as many as 15 Tory candidates are being looked at by the Gambling Commission, with Labour being dragged in too. Could this scandal become election-defining? Following the Labour Party's confusion about its own policy regarding gender ideology and transition, Kemi Badenoch and the actor David Tennant have come to blows over trans rights. And after Nigel Farage's recent comments about Ukraine and the role of NATO expansion, I'll be exploring the deep history of that conflict with a top academic. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my panel, historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop and the journalist and broadcaster Benedict Spence. Now it's time for the news bulletin with Polly Middlehurst.